We should be all seated in such a way that everybody can see everybody else. All right, so one of the things that economics does, or is supposed to do, is to somehow reflect what exists in the real world. Progressive economists feel that mainstream economics doesn't do that, as we heard this morning by some of the speakers on the panel. The idea is to connect economics with the real lived experiences of people in the world. And we have to ask how accurately the economics we learn does that. So for political economy, the objective is to make the connection between what is taught in economics and what exists outside of the field of economics. And of course, one of the ways we do this is to measure an economy. And what we want to do today is to look at how an economy is measured and whether or not it actually tells us something about the real world. So can I ask, are there people here who are not from South Africa?
From this guy.
It hasn't been declared independent yet, so you can stay. So everybody is from South Africa. Okay. I was hoping that we'd have a few people from other parts of the continent, but okay.
Well, I live in Swaziland.
Oh, okay, that counts actually, okay. So, how many are we? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So 4 groups of 4 each, okay. So we're going to break up into 4 groups, and we will choose a different, each group will choose a different country. And we're going to break for 20 minutes, during which time your group will leave the room, and you will use your laptops and your telephones to find out the main products of the particular country you've been given. And you just have to Google main products of Kenya, main products of Zambia. Okay? And you'll get, so even if it's not a comprehensive list, if it's just 5 or 8 products, that's fine. You will then go outside and find things to represent these products. It can be a leaf, it can be a twig, it can be some stones. You can take crumbled paper, use your imagination. We have paper here, we have scissors, we have pens. You will then create little labels for the products that you have come to learn about that country. When you return, we will have a map of the continent on the floor. You will locate the country that you have chosen, that you have selected, and you will place these products on the floor, labeled. Okay? Are the instructions clear to everybody? Yeah? Good. All right, so why don't we do this? Let's go with number 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So all the 1s will come together, all the 2s, all the 3s, all the 4s come together. Are there any particular countries that you'd like to choose? Group number 1. Is there a country that you would like to choose? Preferably on the continent. Ghana. Okay, so number 1.
Yeah.
Number 1 is Ghana.
Number 2, what would you like, which country would you like to select?
Angola.
Angola, okay. Number 2 is Angola. Number 3, which country would you like to select?
Zambia?
Zambia is number 3, okay. So we've got Ghana, we've got Angola, we've got Zambia. Would the other group like to be South Africa? I'd like it for reasons that you'll see later. Okay? So group number 4 will be South Africa. Okay? Good. All right, so you can now go outside. First get together in your groups. All the 1s in one corner, all the 2s in another corner, 3s and 4s. And then you go out, find out what the main products are of the country you're dealing with, and find some materials that would represent these products. Like I said, use your imagination, and just, like I said, use bits of crumbled paper, little plastic bits, plastic cup, whatever. But just be creative. I think Elroy is familiar with this process, so whichever group he's part of, he can guide you. All right? So number 1.
Sorry, I'm going to write the, what has one get marked?
Oh, he's going to get them out. Okay, sorry, we don't have a,
Yeah, no,
those are not the right marks.
we're going to get them now.
All right, but that's fine.
Yeah.
I think you people all know your countries, right? So number 1 is Ghana, number 2 is Angola, number 3 is Zambia, and number 4 is South Africa. So all right, please go ahead, form your groups.
If anyone doesn't have a tablet or smartphone, just let me know. If anyone, like in the groups, if there isn't a group that has
No, it's fine. South Africa as a whole. You call it a horn. Let's take a tour of the continent and just see what the products are in each of the 4 countries. Just become familiar with them. It's 2 minutes, yeah. Just go around and look at the different countries.
We can go and look at the other countries.
Yes, yes. Yeah, just walk around. Take a tour.
Trip.
Okay, is there anything at all that struck you about the products that you saw here on the floor? As a book?
That oil and diamonds. I didn't know much else about Angola.
Okay, which would be what?
Sisal, fish, which is obvious.
Okay.
What you don't have there, coffee as well. What you don't have there is lumber.
Oh, yeah.
Could you find the material?
For?
Lumber, timber.
Oh, lumber, timber.
No, the paper. The paper's lumber.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes, the paper.
Yeah, the paper
Yeah.
would be.
There's the process.
All right.
Oh, it's just revealing.
Okay,
Just see
all
these
right,
two.
that's good, thank you. Yes?
I think most of them are natural resources.
Aha,
Yes,
aha,
very important.
aha,
Except South Africa, there are some processes.
aha. Okay. So what does that tell us? I mean, if we had people from every other country on the continent sitting in this room today, what do you think the picture would look like? Would it be any different?
In any other continent.
No, just
The
Africa.
country in Africa.
Yeah, if we had all the countries of Africa here
No,
today,
be the same.
and they were to put all the products down, would it be any different?
In some cases, worse.
There would be more agriculture.
Right, so,
But South Africa, on there to go to, are we producing or we call ourselves manufacturing, but in essence we are assembling.
Yeah.
although I think there are some models that we
We do produce
produce-
some parts, yes.
no, I think a complete unit. I think there's
Under
one
license.
or two models.
Even a quantum is.
It's all imported goods.
Is it- I understood that there's one, it's one Toyota model that we produce completely. That's, the engine may come from Japan, but I think everything else. Okay, so usually I do this for people who have no background in economics, and from what I see in this room, there are people who are quite familiar with economics. But what we're getting from the display here is a sense of what Africa's economies are actually made up of. Which is what? That these are economies based on what we call primary products. And we know what the major sectors of an economy are in 2018. And we know that all economies begin with two types of products, agricultural and mining. And that's what we see here. We graduate over a period of time, countries that have become more developed, graduate from agriculture and mining to manufacturing. And from manufacturing, they move to the services economy. So the first thing to recognize are the four sectors, the three sectors of the economy. So your primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary, agriculture and mining. Secondary, manufacturing. Tertiary, your services. We take each sector and we can decompose it into industries. And each industry in turn is made up of any number of companies. And that's part of the whole production process. When we take all of these products and put them together in a particular country, we measure what is called GDP, which stands for gross domestic product. Gross meaning totality, domestic meaning related to that country, and of course product. The United States is the only country that uses GNP instead of GDP, because it says gross national product, calculates the earnings or the production activities of Americans in other countries. So it is the only country that is different in that respect. So when we add all of these things up, we get a sense of what a country is actually producing and how much of that it is producing. And then we begin to value these things, or we monetize it. And we say that the totality of these products amounts to X number of dollars. And that gives us GDP. So I think we were going to move to another room now because the electronics isn't working here. So we're moving to 151.
Yes.
Just next door.
Which is just next door. And we're going to carry on our discussion there because there are one or two things that I want to show on the screen. We can figure out what the size of an economy is. How much are they actually producing and what's the value of what they're producing and rank them. So I don't suppose it's a mystery to anybody in this room which is the country with the largest GDP. No, which country here? Of the countries of the entire world here. Which one?
China or US?
She's asking an interesting question
China or
because
US?
there are some studies that show that China is actually the largest economy, standing at 23 point some odd trillion dollars, and the United States at 19.4 trillion. And then but what they're saying is that China's output is 23.4 trillion, but the GDP is not necessarily 23.4 trillion. So that's the kind of thing that the mathematical economists get occupied with. They argue about these things. Okay? So if we, for the longest time, of course, the United States has been the world's #1 economic power, and therefore it has the largest GDP. And we say that China is second. Who would be third? Yeah. So we either use Japan or we use the EU. If we take the EU as a group, then the EU becomes the third and Japan the fourth. Any idea of the 50s?
Where do we follow Africa?
That's a question we're coming to.
Wouldn't it be Germany if you're not taking the EU as well?
Yeah, if you take the EU, then Germany.
Yeah.
If you don't,
If you don't, then
if you
it's
don't take the
Germany,
EU,
yeah.
it's Germany. Yeah. If you take the EU,
South Korea?
no, actually it's India. Yeah, it's just it's really grown. Yeah, tremendously. And it's a good country to look at what GDP actually measures and what it doesn't measure, because for all the wealth that India is creating, it's still a country with massive amounts of poverty. Okay? So that's the one thing we can do with GDP. We can rank countries, and we can simply take all of the countries in the world and put them down on a list and say, here's number 1, here's number 2, here's number 3, here's number 4. The other thing that we can do with GDP is to do a calculation called per capita. So we calculate GDP per capita, which simply means we take the total GDP of a country and we divide it by its population. Okay? So here you'll get some very interesting kind of figures. So you'll get, go back to our map and let's look at Nigeria and let's look at Angola. Both are oil-producing countries. Who do you think has a higher GDP per capita?
Nigeria.
Probably
Angola. Why? Exactly. So Nigeria has a much larger population. If we therefore divide, even if Nigeria is producing more oil and earning more revenue, the fact that its population is so large means that its per capita GDP would be much smaller. Okay? So that's the other thing we can do with per capita GDP. Which other countries would have very high per capita GDPs?
Small countries, like really small countries.
Singapore is one of the small.
Singapore, yeah.
How much?
Exactly. So the Gulf states, all the Gulf states, why? Because they're all oil producing. So massive income, but very small populations. Okay? So they have very high per capita GDPs. Saudi Arabia, Oman, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, etc. So that's the other thing we can do with GDP. We can just take these kinds of mathematical calculations and figure out which countries, where do they lie in terms of their ranking. So when you do per capita GDP, you would find that the so-called developed countries are actually much lower than some of these countries that are still developing. Okay? A third thing that we can do with GDP is take something like our national budgets. So we know that our national budgets are composed of all the line items from each department, right? And every year Treasury goes through the process of allocating a certain amount to every single department. If we want to get a sense of how much a country is spending on a given line item, on a given department, we can take the GDP figure of a country and we can take the expenditure . Sorry, that's not very clear, but the idea was just to put that up. So that would be the totals for South Africa's budget for 2018. Okay. We can take each one of these line items and we can express them as a proportion of GDP. And it becomes a useful indicator for how much money of our national income we are spending in a particular department. So we can take education, for example, and say, well, we spend South Africa, the figures, I might be a little out, I think it's 16% now. But it's 16%, the education budget takes up 16% of our GDP. Well, in a sense, that figure is meaningless unless we begin to look at all the other departments. So we can look at defense, for example, and ask ourselves, well, how much are we spending on defense? If that figure is higher than 16%, then in a sense it reflects our priorities. We are spending money on things that kill people versus money that educates people, that develops people's minds. So that must tell you something about the priority of a particular country. Okay. We can also do the same thing now with, do a kind of international comparison. So we can look at the educational budgets of all the countries in Africa and express them as a proportion of GDP, and then ask ourselves, well, what does the picture look like? What does Malawi spend on education? What does Zambia spend on education? What does Kenya spend on education? We look at all of this and we can begin to see, get a sense of, okay, high, low, medium, okay. But then we could go further with the analysis and say, what is the output of the expenditure on these items? If someone coming out of a high school in Botswana has a much higher level of literacy and numeracy, we can take that comparison and say, well, Botswana, I'm just throwing out a figure now, Botswana spends 8% of its GDP on education. South Africa spends 16% of its GDP on education, but Botswana has much better outcomes. Which means that we can go back and look at why is it that our outcomes are not as good as Botswana's. Is our educational system dysfunctional? Do we have a lot of wastage? And we can begin to reprioritize when we look at the figures like that. So that's the other thing that GDP helps us do. It helps us to make interesting comparisons between countries and within countries. So it's the ranking of GDP by countries, it's the per capita GDP, and it's the GDP by department. All right.
So what we spend on soccer.
Sorry.
Like what we spend on soccer, I mean on sports.
Yes, that's a very...
Nigeria against South Africa.
Yes. And again, for comparison's sake, we can ask ourselves, how much are we spending on sport as compared to social development? Is it worth our while to be spending the money that we spend on sport when we have whole communities that are dysfunctional, that are wracked by violence, unemployment, poverty? So these are questions that we can ask when we begin to look at GDP figures. All right.
Sorry, Zumi, but isn't there a case to be made for rethinking and redefining what development actually is? There's a case to be made for sports as a part of social development.
Yeah.
And as part of building cohesion.
Yes, I'm absolutely aware of that. And I'd love to have those discussions if time allows, but let's get into it. Okay. So, let me just get my train of thought now. Okay. So, if this is what GDP is all about, we're talking essentially about something that is quantitative, right? We count. We simply look at the rands and cents or the dollars and cents, and we try to make sense of it. So it's a quantitative thing. So on that basis, I'm going to say to you, I'm going to suggest to you that I think we need more crime in South Africa.
Yes, I can agree with that because prostitution and gaga usage is now counted in our GDP figures.
Okay, that's one point, yeah.
I agree, you know, I think it's great, you know, because then people buy burglar guards and they hire private security and that creates jobs. And
More police officers.
More
More police.
and if your stuff gets stolen, you have to buy stuff
Aha.
to replace it,
Aha.
and you might want more insurance because you're worried about the crime. And then the GDP will go up, which
All right.
is progress and development.
All right, so see, if it's quantitative, let's just have more crime. We can boost the GDP.
Or maybe like a car accident.
So that was my next point. And my next point is, I think we should have more accidents on our roads.
More doctors. New cars.
I have an accident, I damaged this pillar, that has to be repaired, my car has to be repaired, I'm injured, I got to go to hospital, the doctor's fees, I need more insurance, I may need equipment if I'm crippled.
But my clothes are life.
But then someone else can take your job, so that's great.
And you can die.
And then you pay for a funeral service, and that adds to
Funeral services.
It reminds me of that Section 27 T-shirt. Do you remember? Quite old. ARVs hurt the funeral business.
Ouch. Essentially, when we're arguing in this round, what we're doing now, all we're doing is propagating Keynes' theory that we need to spend.
That's right, it's consumerism. Yeah.
Devoid
That's-
of morality, devoid of consequence.
Yeah, and that's what GDP boils down to. It simply says the more you can produce, the higher your GDP will be, and the better your country will look in terms of international statistics.
But if we focus on skilling, education, it's also going to increase demand.
Yes, of course. So that is
At least that
But
one is
it-
positive.
exactly. That's the key thing. So rather than have 5,000 cars smash one another on the roads, let's look at how we can skill people, because eventually those skills are going to make a contribution to the economy in some way.
In our politics with Leroy, we used to say for America to attack all these countries was exactly for their GDP.
Yes.
Because they more armaments,
Halliburton.
more soldiers.
Very good point, because when you study critical essays on the United States economy, you come up with this idea that I think it was Thorsten Veblen who came up with the concept of the military-industrial complex, which simply means that if you have more war, your GDP will continuously go up. Because for every bomb that you drop, you've got to replace it, right?
And you're going to rebuild the town.
Yes, and then you come in and reconstruction.
Michael Moore, Sicko.
Yes.
Where's your daddy going to Iraq? What's he going to do? Plumbing.
Yeah,
That's good.
but that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're beginning to get a different concept now of GDP as something that is loaded on the side of production, but not necessarily anything else. So I can also suggest to you that I think we should pollute our rivers more and our air. Let's have more pollution.
That would mean negative externalities.
That's
Society pays the cost.
But it's not accounted for in GDP, right?
It increases that interest rate, but it's quite
They don't,
different.
yeah.
Children that don't have parents, child-headed households, increases the burden to the state.
Yes, it does. Yes. Okay. Any comments, questions so far on GDP and how we move from a quantitative to other things?
You mentioned the African economic structure.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we did the research on Ghana, the breakdown of the GDP, the highest in Ghana was services. I think 21 billion, whereas mining was only 3.6 billion.
Yeah, okay, that, yeah.
2.6. So I was trying to understand, even though there is this broad assumption that most African countries, the mining and manufacturing is the most, but when you break down the stats here, you saw services were the highest.
Yeah, so that's
That is,
That's a trend worldwide, by the way, that services are becoming to be a larger and larger part of GDP. And for those of you who perhaps need to know a little more about services, if I go and have a haircut, okay, that's a service. If I walk into a lawyer's office, it's a service. If I walk into a doctor's office, it's a service.
Banking.
Banking. And that has become a very big part of a lot of economies now, is the financial system. So banking is a very big part, and that's a service. Okay. So we see this trend of services climbing higher and higher. But also there are countries that are in the process of almost de-industrialization now. And that becomes a subject on its own. Yeah. So we can pick that up if we have time a little later in the discussion. Okay. So what does GDP not capture?
Household productive.
Right. So our mothers spend thousands of hours feeding us, clothing us, bathing us, keeping us safe and secure. Do you think any of your mother's value shows up in GDP?
No. No.
So this is where we get into the whole thing about reproduction, and the fact that reproduction is almost automatically associated with women. One of the great failings of GDP is that it doesn't capture women's work. And I believe this was probably discussed in another workshop this morning. So that is, the fact that we are here is because of our mothers. And if that work is not valued, if her work is not valued, then what is GDP actually measuring? Because if it weren't for our mothers, how many of us would actually survive? And yet that is not captured. The other thing that GDP does not capture is voluntary work. You and I can go into our communities from door to door, get people organized around whatever issues, orphans, violence, feeding the poor, etc., etc. It will never get captured by GDP. Until such time, of course, as we go and buy a physical product in a store as part of our volunteer activity.
And the fact that our economies are pushing voluntarism is essential to the economy all the time now. Increasingly, people are expected to volunteer. The poorest are expected to volunteer. The richest aren't.
That's right, yes. And when you think just about the number of people in poor communities who spend their time doing voluntary work, it never gets counted for. So it's voluntary work and it's reproduction work that doesn't get captured by GDP. Anything else?
The informal sector?
The informal sector. Okay. Now, with the informal sector, a part of it gets captured in GDP. Because if I'm an informal trader, I go to someone who already has a factory who's producing goods, and I buy from him, and I then go and sell. So it does get recorded somewhat. But my activity as an informal trader doesn't get captured. Yeah. What else?
Many years ago, there was a big debate in NELAC. For those of us old enough, banks didn't want to give collateral to houses in townships, formal townships. So there was the SACP,
The red line.
yeah, the red line. So the banks have made a decision that that's not for them, and it's not worthy of being insured, or
right.
standing as
Finance
collateral.
cost, right, yeah. All right. So we're beginning to see something about GDP that's quite deficient in terms of human development. It simply doesn't capture the things that really matter to most of us in our lives. And then there is one important thing that GDP really doesn't capture at all. What would that be?
Inequalities. It assumes that we are all just benefiting equally.
Look, if you do the per capita GDP calculation, it kind of gives you a false sense, you know. So there are 16 of us in this room, and if we earn 1,600, if our GDP is 1,600, it means each of us are sort of worth 100 rand. Okay.
What's the impact of imported goods and services to GDP?
Yeah, okay, so that's a technical question. It doesn't get counted into GDP as far as the domestic product is concerned. But when those products go through the motions of being sold, they will be captured. So you could import something and it'll show in national accounts, we can see import and export figures. But when we do GDP itself, there's a formula that we use. GCI, do you recall?
C plus I plus G plus X minus Z.
Thank you. So it's exports minus imports to get the net figure. Okay. So it's kind of taken out in the formula. So it counts to some extent, but generally when they're figuring out, they say how much was imported, and they minus that from the exports, and then they get a net figure. Okay. All right. So I'm saying that the one thing that GDP does not make.
There's one other thing.
Yes.
That is uniquely South African.
Yes.
If you travel on all the continent, you will never see any city that is built to keep the poor far from the center of the CBD. When you use the word downtown, the lower income communities live in the center of the city. The persistence of apartheid spatial geography continues to dominate city infrastructure, architecture. We work in Khayelitsha at the East Rivana Center. The couriers don't want to come there because it's perceived as danger. The average cost of, and I have to make this distinction you'll understand, a black African person in Cape Town is the worst in terms of cost for a so-called colored person living closer to the center of Cape Town to people who live in Newlands roundabout. The time they take to travel, the fact that scholars are daily punished because the trains are not working, you don't find that in any other city. So the cost of doing work, of getting educated, is disproportionate, and that should be in the formula that our sister has quoted.
Yeah, so just to add on to the point that Elroy is making here, is that South Africa has one of the longest commuting distances of people going to and from work. And it hasn't changed really in 24 years of our transition.
Brett Governor, as the HRC Commissioner, has shown that the water and sanitation and the poverty is still showing patterns of former Bantustan.
Yeah.
That's it.
That means the social reproduction calculation needs to factor in it.
That's right.
And the effect. And it's not only transport, it's everything that it takes.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, Zunaid, I think if you're asking what's the big thing that GDP doesn't capture, it speaks to all of these things. It's like well-being, right? Like how it doesn't really tell you anything about how people live or how they engage in the world.
Exactly, and maybe the one word that can capture all of that, if you don't like the word well-being, is happiness. I'm coming to that. Yeah. But what GDP does not capture is that. So if we looked at the United States, here is a country with a $20 trillion economy. Can we say that every American is happy?
With the gun.
It's trigger. So, that's very good. Trigger happy, yes. So, just as they came up with GNP, so in the mid to late 70s, they came up with this concept of gross national happiness. And they began to look at GDP critically and ask the question, does this actually measure what human beings feel in a given society? And is there a way in which we can capture this? So there's only one country in the world that has now done this for me. Anyone know who it is?
Bhutan.
Bhutan, that's right. So Bhutan came up with this formula for calculating happiness. And more recent figures show that usually the Scandinavian countries are at the top of the list as far as happiness is concerned. Denmark scores very high. And you get a whole variety of things that you can begin to unpack as far as the happiness factor is concerned. When people grow up in societies where the perception that it is a fair society means that they have less of a propensity to commit crime. Just the perception that I live in a fair society means that I have less of a propensity to commit a crime. So this is just taking the happiness factor to a different level. So it'll be interesting for us to look at these countries that have high happiness indexes. So over the past 30 years or so, lots of people have begun to apply their minds to coming up with an alternative to GDP and to ask what actually should we be measuring instead of what we have been measuring. So your next exercise, as you go to your tea break now, go back into your groups, and I'd like each of the 4 groups to come up with a set of alternative indicators that would measure what you would consider to be important to you and your society. Clear? Yeah? And then each one of you will do a short presentation. So you will nominate a spokesperson in your group, and you will do a 3-minute presentation on what you think should be part of an alternative indicator. All right, so you can please do that during your tea break. Oh yes, please. Yes. All right. To close this part of the session, any questions, comments?
It seems to be fine.
Quick question. With regards to measuring or discussing what we want our country to measure, are we limited to things that are measurable in the common quantitative understanding?
Kind of objective stuff.
Yeah.
No, you're not limited. In other words, we just want to say, well, what would give you a sense of well-being? So I could be living in a society surrounded by an array of products, fancy cars, terrific laptops and smartphones, beautiful designer clothes, you know. How much does this represent happiness? And is that happiness, it could certainly generate some happiness. So I could go out and buy that 4x4 now, and I could be really happy But for how long? Would I be just as happy a year from now? 2 years from now? Would I then decide, well, maybe it's time for another 4x4 because my happiness level has dropped? So you keep refueling because the happiness is not permanent. Does it partially answer your question? But the idea is we want to think broadly. What matters to us as a society? Is this what we are chained to? That everything that is quantifiable will make up GDP, and that'll really give us happiness in the end. What are the other little things that would make a difference? Your environment, your social relations. We know that for some recent studies in New York City say that something like 67% of the people in New York City suffer from loneliness. And you know how some of us just love, oh, I'm off to New York City. You know, it has this image for us as this place to go to. 67% of the people in New York City are lonely. So, you know, you could go for days in New York City and not say hello to anybody.
Months, people die.
Yeah.
Their bodies decompose. And sorry to be morbid.
No, you're right. You're right.
Okay, so. Okay.
So our group decided on a number of things. It was less about the specific things, but more about the conversation we had that led to each person's kind of identification or critique of what the problems we're currently facing are, which led to each person in their own way expressing what they think we should be valuing and what's currently not being valued, but is quite fundamental in terms of what's happening in real people's lives. So we have caregiving and reproductive labor at the top, which kind of kicked off the conversation. We can do the next one.
Inclusivity, right? So we spoke about that from a lot of different perspectives, that it can be along gender lines, racial lines, it can be about urban and rural people, right? And their inclusion in the economy and how we think about how progress how progress happens. Okay, we spoke about essential but non-wage labor. So one of our comrades over here was talking about us as volunteers who are, well, part volunteers, partly we're employed to run this festival, right? But most of the students here are volunteering their time to kind of to be part of this, and that's not something that would be included when we talk about that. That's just a small example, right? That's here. Intellectual stimulation and expansion of educational horizons. So this is something that I one day raised. Do you want to talk to
in terms of the limited, I forgot who it was, but someone earlier was speaking about how, I don't even think it was here, sorry, it was in a different session where someone was an educator and talking about how the Minister of Education or the Ministry of Education would say, oh, we need children to be able to read because if they can read good, they can go out and, you know, get a job and make money for the country. And I felt that, well, we talk a lot about education in this country and we never really talk about the purpose of education beyond employment. What about education for growth, you know, intellectual growth, and just general expansion of a person's potential, which goes beyond just creating an automaton that can be employed. So I think intellectual stimulation and expansion of educational horizons is a very important thing that a country should value.
And it allows for you to make deeper human connections as well, right? Which I think is also important. Rest and relaxation and free time, I think they go together, right? So I was saying one of the big things for me around the problems with capitalism is that we're told that we have like freedom of choice, right? But we spend all of our time stuck in wage labor, and most people are stuck in labor that they don't necessarily enjoy, that they aren't necessarily happy with. Sorry, we're having a workshop. Okay. So basically, I think that's a big thing, right? Free time and the choice to do with your time what you would like, and to be able to rest and relax, which actually is also important to the economy, because if you have people who are happy and relaxed, then they're like they're better able to contribute to the well-being of everyone. Do you want to artistic expression?
Artistic expression. So this one's also kind of important for me in the sense that art is only thought of as something to be consumed in the capitalist sense of it. I buy art, it's a product, it's made. But art goes as far back as human history or recorded history. Art is something we've been doing since we've been around, which says something fundamental about art. It represents how we perceive ourselves in our environment. So I think that it would be valuable for a country to allow for artistic expression, in the sense that people should be able to consume art in the non-commodified sense of being able to access and engage in art forms which speak about the experience. Because currently there's a lot of art being produced and a lot of artists who produce works that people they speak about and people they represent will never be able to engage with.
So I'll speak on health and happiness, and I think at this point our conversation pretty much drifted to a point where we even started questioning the GDP, that do we even really need a measure of a form like a GDP? So we spoke more in terms of the global concepts, like thinking globally but locally, and we look at how we can grow our economies from a more micro level in a more sustainable way that enables equitability in space, that fosters people in the space be happy, have more time, have efficiency in public transport. Because Joburg and Cape Town, hectic traffic, everyone is on the road, everyone is ready to go on a road rage, and it's all the stress that you are carrying of being on traffic for 2 hours. Whereas in cities, in countries such as Japan, very, very high performing economies, people are living longer. This public transport system and the efficiencies in the local economy, it's rooted on the ground, and people have more time to cycle. And we spoke about Tai Chi in Thailand in the morning. So people spend more time relaxing and free time, and that gives them there's more purpose and a space for actual growth than just doubling on the numbers of the GDP. So how do we start appreciating what we're doing locally, and appreciate that? And also we spoke about how the conditions of the poorest people are changing. So that could be, I think it would be hard to measure it from a national perspective. It's a more local thing that we take care. It used to be like that. We used to care for one another in the community. No one used to go hungry. So the world is absurd now that we draw a lot of food. Some people are hungry. There's so much excess food. It doesn't make sense how capitalism works. And so you can speak about this point.
Which basically touches on that, how egalitarian the society is, how equal is everyone. I think that's an important thing for a country to focus on, is equality in the sense that does everyone have equal access and equal opportunity. There's one thing to say that we're all free because we're citizens of a country, and the Constitution says you have freedom of speech, you have freedom to vote, we have the right to do those things. But I think it's important that society emphasizes that everyone has the ability to equally participate in those processes also. So how egalitarian a society is also another important factor.
I mean, I think our last question is kind of, we've already touched on, right? But like, is production benefiting local societies? So these were some of the questions we started talking about at the end, and I think you can see how they're all linked, right, to each other, and also linked to this question of, you know, if we're talking about measurement and how we measure development or progress, should we be looking at it at a like country level? Should we be looking at it at a local level? Like, what are the best ways to understand what's happening in our society and therefore to affect change, right? So I think all of those things kind of link up, and that also has an effect on the environment, right? And I think that's the next biggest crisis that we're all facing, and none of us are going to be able to get out of it. And so environmental sustainability is obviously a huge thing that right now GDP doesn't account for. In fact, measuring progress and using GDP as our prime indicator often means that we negate and forget about like the environmental degradation and externalities that are happening.
If I may add to the group, the issue about where the focus is came about because of the fact that the gross geographic product of metros, let's take the three biggest ones, Ekurhuleni, City of Johannesburg, Tshwane, okay, and Cape Town. If you add all of that up, that's like the budgets of 5 provinces, right? So when we talk about state capture, we still think state capture South Africa's border, but state capture also involves municipality, the district municipality, the province. Where's the focus, and what is the? It pulled us back to the question of what then should the purpose of the GDP be in the future, and the negation and the missing of critical factors when you don't measure other things is again unique for South Africa.
Okay. Thank you very much, guys.
Oh yeah.
Well done, guys. Well done. Well done. Good team. Well done.
From our group, what to include in the GDP. The first one is access and ownership to decent housing or land. Like for instance, not everyone wants to be a farmer, not everyone wants to pursue the commercial side of the land, but everyone deserves a home to raise their families. For instance, let me make an example. I live in Cape Town, in Lusuko. It's between Philippi and Kailicha. Like I've seen people try to occupy vacant land, and then the police will come, there'll be tear gas, there'll be a lot. It's just human decency. They just want to have homes, they don't have huge farms. So I think that should be included, like the number of people who have their own homes. So I think that should be included in the GDP, that's what we think. And then the second one, quality of healthcare and education. So we already have the Human Development Index, but it's still not considered mainstream. It's still not included in the GDP. So when we talk about healthcare and education, it's not just access. Because we've seen from the graph that a lot of proportion, if you're comparing a lot it is spent on education and healthcare. But we also need to go deeper, like the quality of that healthcare. Like we're spending this amount, but how much of it is going to compensation? How much of it is going to textbooks? So we put a lot of emphasis on the quality of the, not just building hospitals, but are the patients satisfied with the quality of healthcare? Because if they're not satisfied, then they're not going to go. The hospital will be there, but people still not be making use of that hospital. Financial inclusion, looking at, so that could be measured somewhere with looking at household savings, like how much people are saving. Because if you are able to save, then it says something about your welfare to an extent. So we can use that to look at we can infer people's welfare based on how much they are saving. I'll do this one then she'll finish the other stuff. So inclusive development, so far development is still very concentrated in Joburg or in Cape Town, and then we're not including people from the rural areas, hence most of us have to move to Cape Town or move to Joburg. So we also feel that we should be a measure that will look at an inclusive group. Are we including the disabled? Are we including the rural people? Are we including like a black, yeah, without being political, but yeah, inclusive in those sense.
Okay, then obviously our previous group had also picked up on this, the state of our environment. It's no good to go and exploit all our natural resources and then at the end of the day we're left with a merely trickling polluted river which none of us can live off. We've also seen the impacts of our climate change just in the Western Cape and in the Eastern Cape right now. I'm sure you're aware that some of the dams around the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro are sitting at a capacity of 7% right now. There's water shedding in some of our towns. So that hasn't been considered. All they're worried about is the fact that GDP measurement of our export production of citrus fruit has fallen, not the other impacts on our community. Then in terms of the importance of sports, we see that as being something that should be included in GDP, not only because it will improve our social cohesion by playing together, it will also improve our health. And by improving our health, we will be reducing the cost to the state through all the negative effects of things like cholesterol and diabetes and such like. Then with that, we're also linking it to the importance of arts and culture. And this was again something our previous group had touched on. Arts and culture play a part in our history, and we've lost a lot of that. We only, as you said, want to commodify arts. There's no appreciation anymore of these gatherings and the way that we can share knowledge through the various forms of art. Just from an educational perspective, you know, we are so rigid in the way that we test students. It's got to be multiple choice or long questions, that's it. And yet there's a wide range of methods that could be used to test students, including pictorial essays. And that is not something which is generally a mainstream idea in BCom fields in South Africa. So by embracing that, it could be something that could be looked at later on. The equality of workers' conditions, the split of profits. We obviously very concerned about the situation where a CEO will be earning 23 times what the ground floor worker will be earning. We know that the arguments go, yes, but the CEO has got an MBA and the ground floor worker has only got a grade 10. So how can the grade 10 educated worker earn the same as the CEO? We're not disputing the fact that higher qualifications should go with higher earnings, but we're saying, can't we follow a model such as those in the Scandinavian countries where there's more equality, once again, a topic which you guys picked up on. And together with that, it comes with productivity. A worker will give their all, and it's stated in our theory, if they are going to be compensated, if we can go and have a share scheme in place, if they can see their role in the end product.
And also on this nice point, we should also take into account the fact that we're actually fueling inequality. Yeah. If you're going to give someone 2,000 rand to raise 5 kids, you are determining the quality of education, the quality of health that those children are going to receive. So the cycle is just going to keep continuing, and then CEO's children will continue to be on that path. Okay. Yeah. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Leave it.
Yeah.
All right. Any issues that anyone wants to raise with the two presentations? Something that has cropped up in your mind now that you didn't think of before? Okay, so there's several alternative indicators that have been developed over the past 25 years now. They're getting more and more sophisticated, and they capture a lot of what you people have said here. And I thought I had it on my hard drive and I couldn't find it, and then I can't find my flash drive either right now. So I'm sorry that I can't put one of those things up, but we are running out of time anyway. And I think the other groups are probably going to attend other sessions right now than some of our other members. So we'll just jump to a video that I would like us to view. Okay, are we ready? Yeah.
On the 4th of January, 1934, a young man delivered a report to the United States Congress that 80 years on still shapes the lives of everyone in this room today. Still shapes the lives of everyone on this planet. That young man wasn't a politician, he wasn't a businessman, a civil rights activist, or a faith leader. He was that most unlikely of heroes, an economist. His name was Simon Kuznets, and the report that he delivered was called National Income 1929 to 1932. Now you might think this is a rather dry and dull report, and you're absolutely right. It's dry as a bone. But this report is the foundation of how today we judge the success of countries, what we know best as gross domestic product, GDP. GDP has defined and shaped our lives for the last 80 years. And today I want to talk about a different way to measure the success of countries, a different way to define and shape our lives for the next 80 years. But first, we have to understand how GDP came to dominate our lives. Kuznets' report was delivered at a moment of crisis. The US economy was plummeting into the Great Depression, and policymakers were struggling to respond. Struggling because they didn't know what was going on. They didn't have data and statistics. So what Kuznets' report gave them was reliable data on what the US economy was producing, updated year by year. And armed with this information, policymakers were eventually able to find a way out of the slump. And because Kuznets' invention was found to be so useful, it spread around the world, and now today every country produces GDP statistics. But in that first report, Kuznets himself delivered a warning. It's in the Introductory Chapter, on page 7, he says, "The welfare of a nation can therefore scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income as defined above." It's not the greatest soundbite in the world, and it's dressed up in the cautious language of the economist. But his message was clear. GDP is a tool to help us measure economic performance. It's not a measure of our well-being, and we shouldn't be a guide to all decision-making. But we have ignored Kuznets' warning. We live in a world where GDP is the benchmark of success in our global economy. Our politicians boast when GDP goes up. Markets move and trillions of dollars of capital move around the world based on which countries are going up and which countries are going down, all measured in GDP. Our societies have become engines to create more GDP. But we know that GDP is flawed. It ignores the environment. It counts bombs and prisons as progress. It can't count happiness or community. And it has nothing to say about fairness or justice. Is it any surprise that our world, marching to the drumbeat of GDP, is teetering on the brink of environmental disaster and filled with anger and conflict? We need a better way to measure our societies. A measure based on the real things that matter to real people. Do I have enough to eat? Can I read and write? Am I safe? Do I have rights? Do I live in a society where I'm not discriminated against? Is my future and the future of my children prevented from environmental destruction? These are questions that GDP does not and cannot answer. There have, of course, been efforts in the past to move beyond GDP. 2008, how our fetish for economic growth led us so far astray. We've seen in the Arab Spring how countries like Tunisia were supposedly economic superstars, but they were societies being full of seething with discontentment. We're ready because today we have the technology to gather and analyse data in ways that would have been unimaginable to Kuznets. Today I'd like to introduce you to the Social Progress Index. It's a measure of the well-being of society completely separate from GDP. It's a whole new way of looking at the world. The Social Progress Index begins by defining what it means to be a good society, based around 3 dimensions. The first is, does everyone have the basic needs for survival? Food, water, shelter, safety. Secondly, does everyone have access to the building blocks to improve their lives? Education, information, health, and a sustainable environment. And then third, does every individual have access to a chance to pursue their goals and dreams and ambitions free from obstacles? Do they have rights, freedom of choice, freedom from discrimination, and access to the world's most advanced knowledge? Together, these 12 components form the Social Progress Framework. And for each of these 12 components, we have indicators to measure how countries are performing. Not indicators of effort or intention, but real achievement. We don't measure how much a country spends on healthcare. We measure the length and quality of people's lives. We don't measure whether governments pass laws against discrimination. We measure whether people experience discrimination. But what you want to know is who's top, don't you? I knew that. Okay, I'm going to show you this chart. So here we are. So what I've done here is put on the vertical axis social progress. Higher is better. And then, just for comparison, just for fun, on the horizontal axis is GDP per capita. Yeah? And further to the right is more. Okay. So, the country in the world with the highest social progress. The number 1 country on social progress is New Zealand. Well, never been, must go. The country with the least social progress, I'm sorry to say, is Chad. I've never been, maybe next year. Or maybe the year after. Now, I know you're thinking, aha, but New Zealand has a higher GDP than Chad. It's a good point, well made. But let me show you 2 other countries. Here's the United States, considerably richer than New Zealand, but with a lower level of social progress. And then here's Senegal. It's got a higher level of social progress than Chad, at the same level of GDP. So what's going on? Well, let me bring in the rest of the countries of the world, the 132 we've been able to measure, each one represented by a dot. There we go, lots of dots. Now obviously I can't do all of them, so a few highlights for you. The highest ranked G7 country is Canada. My country, the United Kingdom, is sort of middling, sort of dull, but who cares? At least we beat the French. Economies, the BRICS, top of the BRICS, please to say, Brazil. Come on, cheer! Go Brazil. Beating South Africa, then Russia, then China, and then India. Tucked away on the right-hand side, you will see a dot of a country with a lot of GDP, but not a huge amount of social progress. That's Kuwait. And just above Brazil is a social progress superpower. That's Costa Rica. The level of social progress the same in some Western European countries with a much lower GDP. Now, my slide is getting a little distorted, and I'd like to step back a bit. So let me take away these countries and then pop in the regression line. So this shows the average relationship between GDP and social progress. And the first thing to notice is that there's lots of noise around the trend line. And what this shows, what this empirically demonstrates, is that GDP is not destiny. At every level of GDP per capita, there are opportunities for more social progress, risks of less. The second thing to notice is that the poor countries, the curve is really steep. So what this tells us is that if poor countries can get a little bit of extra GDP, and if they reinvest that in doctors, nurses, water supply, sanitation, etc., there's a lot of social progress bound from GDP bump. And that's good news, and that's what we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, with a lot of people lifted out of poverty by economic growth and good policies in poorer countries. But go a bit further up the curve, and then we see it flattening out. Each extra dollar of GDP is buying less and less social progress. And with more and more of the world's population living on this part of the curve, it means GDP is becoming less and less useful as a guide to our development. I'll show you an example of Brazil. Here's Brazil. Social progress of about 70 out of 100. GDP per capita of about $14,000 a year. And look, Brazil's above the line. Brazil is doing a reasonably good job of turning GDP into social progress. But where does Brazil go next? Let's say that Brazil adopts a bold economic plan to double GDP in the next decade. But that is only half a plan. It's less than half a plan. Because where does Brazil want to go on social progress? Brazil, it's possible to increase your growth, increase your GDP, while stagnating or going backwards on social progress. We don't want Brazil to become like Russia. What you really want is for Brazil to get ever more efficient at creating social progress from its GDP, so it becomes more like New Zealand. And what that means is that Brazil needs to prioritize social progress in its development plan and see that it's not just growth alone, it's growth with social progress. And that's what the Social Progress Index does. It reframes the debate about development, not just about GDP alone, but inclusive, sustainable growth that brings real improvements in people's lives. And it's not just about countries. Earlier this year, with our friends from the Amazon non-profit here in Brazil, we launched the first subnational social progress index. When you look for the Amazon region, it's an area the size of Europe, 24 million people, one of the most deprived parts of the country. Here are the results. And this is broken down into nearly 800 different municipalities. And with this detailed information about the real quality of life in this part of the country, Amazon and other partners from government, business and civil society can work together to construct a development plan that will help really improve people's lives while protecting that precious global asset that is the Amazon rainforest. And this is just the beginning. We can create a social progress index for any state, region, city, or municipality. We all know we have TEDx. This is Social Progress X. This is a tool for anyone to come and use. Contrary to the way we sometimes talk about it, GDP was not handed down from God on tablets of stone. It's a measurement tool invented in the 20th century to address the challenges of the 20th century. In the 21st century, we face new challenges: aging, obesity, climate change, and so on. To face those challenges, we need new tools of measurement, new ways of valuing progress. Imagine if we could measure what non-profits, charities, volunteers, civil society organisations really contribute to our society. Imagine if businesses competed not just on the basis of their economic contribution, but on their contribution to social progress. Imagine if we could hold politicians to account for really improving people's lives. Imagine if we could work together, government, business, civil society, me, you, and make this century the century of social progress. Thank you.
Is there any one point that stood out for you in this discussion in the video?
Everyone agrees on what matters and what should be measured. There seems to be some consistency across that. It's more than intuitive that what we think or what we value is not being measured. But it's not that everyone has different things. It's very similar.
Right.
Even the things he put up were very similar.
Right, exactly. Okay. Anyone else?
In 2002, when I was your age, I had the privilege of going to the World Social Forum in Brazil. And there was a lot of talk about art here. And I was thinking, what if this Rifa Festival happened in Porto Alegre? It would have been different. How would it have been different? Well, when we were at Puke University, setting just like this, it was lunchtime, and the chessboards came up, and people started singing and playing guitar, completely voluntary, and dancing with each other. That's the culture in Brazil. In March, the Kano organization, most of us went to Cuba, and we spent a week in Havana. There is no homelessness there. The same culture like Brazil is there, singing. There is the respect for the wisdom of older men and women. A man who now exports the most honey, can only sell it to the Cuban government, has worked with an old man who was a water diviner. And he found the well on 47 farms of where to strike water. And it is this 80-year-old man that dug a hole 7 meters when this young man, the farmer, younger than me, Fernando Nunes, who's now exporting honey, had to listen to the wisdom. His friends thought he's mad. The point I'm trying to make is, don't wait for this thing to implode by the generation to the young people that failed you. Just start with it. And it will become culture.
So I'll just touch on what we were speaking about our yesterday. It's clear that South Africa is a very progressive country in terms of, we are fed this negative light about South Africa, but there's so much beauty that's within that we can tap into. So we just need to be optimistic as young people. All the negativity that clouds us, but just always try to re-energize ourselves and have the sense that it's everyone's duty to just contribute in any way. And yeah, just try block the negativity that consumes us through newspapers who always have negative stories to tell, whereas there's many other beautiful stories that exist in the country that we are not told. Yeah. So optimism is, we need that as young people.
Thank you very much. Anyone from this side of the room?
I think
Sorry.
very similar to what was said in the plenary session and in the previous session I was at. The thing is, the talk is there. Just like there's the talk of rethinking our economics curriculum. The acknowledgement is, yes, there's a problem, we need to do something. But when is this going to happen? Where is the commitment from governments, from the United Nations, from the World Bank? Because the problem, which maybe is only in my mind when I see a measure like this, is we are so dominated by the IMF, the World Bank. If there isn't buy-in from them, the rest of you, you're wasting your time doing this measure, because you can do it until you're blue in the face. They'll go, that's very nice. Moving on to where's that GDP figure? Yes. Yeah.
The point that I found most enlightening in his presentation was when he did the curve. And he was saying that for every small increase in GDP, there is no commensurate increase in social progress.
Yeah.
So meaning you can go on producing and producing, but you're not going to change the social progress of your people. I think that was brilliant. So it doesn't really, beyond a certain point, it really doesn't matter. Whereas he was saying, is that those countries that are doing well on social progress indicators at the moment, if they could just up their GDP a little more, they would actually push their social progress even a little further. That was a good point.
And what is our focus right now in inflation?
Yes.
Well, I think that's a really strong message here is the conversation that says it's not going to come from the World Bank and the UN and the national governments. It's going to come from social movements, civil society, the new versions of Porto Alegre.
Yes.
And we have to be with that, and we have to be with the young energy of hope and passion that will take us forward. And won't have us locked into a fear of artificial intelligence and the fourth industrial revolution that's going to leave us jobless. And
Exactly.
So,
Thank you. All right, just to wrap up, is there anything about the day that stood out for you that you'd like to just mention in 30 seconds?
So I think that the curriculum is being
About the session,
decolonized.
sorry, not the day. About the session, so.
But just generally that we're having these conversations now, and through that process it's being decolonized. It's not gonna, decolonization will not happen when the cause outline changes, but it's all around the mindset, and studying is not in classroom, but it's a holistic spectrum that we need to be able to gather knowledge and be present. And yeah, that's the decolonial project. It's not going to change with the cause outline.
Anyone else?
What stood out for me was, I think in order for us to see growth is to start to see the people who are at a lower ranking of the society to be at a better level than they are. Then we can say that we are really progressing as a country, really moving forward towards growth. Because if we say we're growing, but there's still the people at the bottom of the thing, it doesn't make sense.
Very good. Anyone else? Anything about the session that you'd like to say that was a highlight for you?
well, it was just really, for me, it was really heartening, your method at the beginning, the inclusivity, the fun, the logic of it, the links we could make between the practical question of picking up a stone and a leaf and seeing it translated into the continent, translated into this discussion. It's really lovely to be in a university and have that methodology. Thank you, sorry. I know.
Yeah, I just want to say, you know, as people are speaking, and I'm thinking, where should this start? Shouldn't it start there? Not up here? Because at this level, the mindset, because at least if it started there, by the time they come to university, the mindset and the attitude. No, I'm really saying, you know, the mindset of the students, you know, is that one. So to me, it's not going to start there, you know. It must start there if we want to go it.
Yes.
It's not only rethinking economics for Africa, for higher institutions of learning, for everybody. It should start at primary.
Strongly agree.
I think that should be. Then we're not going to have a mindset that says I come to lectures only for tests.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
you know, I come then when I want to lectures, you want to turn around
Yes.
the spin-off.
Yes. Thank you. It's a very good point. Yeah. Elwood?
Very brief. I think you taught me, when I was with Fairshare at one of the sessions, that the original meaning of the word economy comes from the Greek oikos nomos,
That's right.
which means about the well-being of the household.
Yeah.
Did you know that?
That's
Now it's
crazy.
computers and graphs and stuff, right? So Nate teased me when I said, I'm coming to your session. He said, no, don't come. Because I know how to read budgets. I've been in lockup with the treasury. And I told him, I came to your session and I went to the previous session on the feminist economic approaches. So people were burning candles, we were centering ourselves. The formal economists who deal with numbers will think they cuckoo. But that process helped me remember when you go into that lockup, there's a panic, there's a psychological stress. Like on one page in social development, about 17 is the increase, and what is that relative to GDP? Is it keeping track with inflation? You know? And then it's about the well-being of the household. Remember that, Elder. Remember that. How many families are going to be left destitute because the grant can't keep up? And should the grant be used as the intervention? And why is there this preoccupation with the GDP? On what page is it? What sentence was that? I got 2 hours. Do you understand what I'm saying? This helped me center. This must help people claim the economies for themselves. Otherwise, it's outsourced to those wise people out there. Believe me, they do not have your interest at heart.
Thank you, all right.
So thank you, Zuman.
All right, well, that we can bring our session to a close. Thank you very much for your participation. I hope it has been useful to you. Thank you.